I love taxes. Not doing them so much as thinking about how taxes can improve society and benefit people. Most of the public debate in the United States about taxes runs from them being a necessary evil, an unfortunate side effect of paying for the services we want as a nation, to being just plain evil. But I want to challenge that way of thinking. Are there cases in which the tax itself is good and can benefit society and communities? I say the answer is yes, but before I explain how, let me first introduce how economists talk about taxes in the first place. And to explain, I'll use an example of a product that most people in the US are familiar with buying: gasoline. Bear with me for a moment. When economists want to explain how much something costs, they refer to two basic principles. The first is the law of demand. This is the principle that says that if something is more expensive, fewer people will buy it. With gas, you can see this relationship as time passes through the seasons. More people want to drive in the summer, and sellers know there isn't as much to go around, so they raise the price so that people who don't need the gas quite as much decide to buy a little less. The other principle is the law of supply, which says that if something's really expensive, more people will try to sell that thing if they can. And again, if people are willing to pay a lot for gas, you might occasionally see OPEC decide to sell more oil worldwide so they can make more money. Now, for something like gas in particular, there are some other factors that influence supply, which we'll come back to in a moment. Where these two lines cross is where you'll find how much gas is being bought and sold, and at what price. So what happens if you add a tax to this chart? Well, a tax adds an artificial barrier between these two lines. The people buying the gas are paying a little more for it, so they wind up buying a little less. And the people selling the gas are getting a little less for it, so they also don't sell as much. So this illustrates one reason why economists might not like a tax. There's a group of people who would prefer to buy some gas, but decide not to because it's just a little bit too expensive. This is referred to as the deadweight loss of the tax. Economists want these people to be happy, and the tax is getting in their way. So how can this be a good thing? Because of externalities. An externality is the word for what happens when a buyer and a seller make an exchange, but people other than the buyer and seller are affected. And when it comes to buying gasoline, we know there are some pretty big externalities. What people tend to do with the gasoline they buy is they burn it running motors. This has a lot of negative effects on people's health, and as you may have heard, on the planet's global temperature and ability to sustain life. These negative effects are often felt by people who are not at all part of the transaction of buying and selling gasoline. Sometimes you can put a dollar value on these effects. The healthcare costs of treating respiratory disorders, or the cost of cleaning up carbon emissions in the atmosphere, for example. In that case, we have an excellent example of how to internalize the cost of the externality, using the taxes we described before. Add up the societal cost of all the problems caused by burning gas, then divide that cost evenly across all the gallons of gas being sold, and then charge that amount as the tax people are required to pay for their gas. If you're worried about problems that may not have a dollar amount attached to them, you can still use this strategy. Just instead of having a target dollar value, have a target quantity, whatever's safe to prevent dire consequences, and then set the tax at whatever size pushes the quantity bought and sold down to that safe level. These kinds of taxes are called Pigovian taxes, and they're central to environmental economics. The good news is that either strategy will work. Both have the positive effect of reducing the unhealthy damages to society and the world, even if you don't have the exact economic justice of people causing harm in the world paying an exact proportion to the harm they cause. But speaking of economic justice, there's another way that tax itself could be good for society, and it has to do with the other factors that influence the supply of gasoline that I mentioned before. When you buy gas, you're paying for several things: a clerk guarding the store, a truck to ship the gas to where you are, a refinery to turn crude oil into something your motor will burn, and the actual oil found in the ground under a plot of land someone bought. But that last one's a little different from the others. For all these others, people can choose to do more or less of it based on how much they get paid. But you can't change the amount of oil that's in the ground. In fact, if you could see the chart for the theoretical finite amount of crude oil that rests in the crust of the earth, you'd see a perfectly vertical supply line. There is what there is, and the price won't change it one bit. And wait, what if there's high demand for crude oil in the ground? This means that even after paying for all these other costs of bringing you the gas that you can burn in your car, someone can make a lot of money just by having their name on a deed to some property if there's oil underneath it.
Why don't I own this?
If that sounds unjust to you, there are some economists who agree with you. They argue it's unjust not to tax money people make from land value or natural resources. Buildings on top of land shouldn't be taxed, just like the cost of digging oil out of the ground and refining it. But they argue that you shouldn't be able to get rich just because your name is on a property. And if you add a tax in this situation, it doesn't change the price. In fact, the supplier pays the whole tax. This kind of tax has been called a Georgist tax, or historically, a single tax, based on the belief that this kind of tax could replace all other taxes needed to run a government. Both these kinds of taxes work pretty well when they're tried. For example, consider the Alaska Permanent Fund, which levies a tax on the money oil companies make drilling for oil in the region. Alaska's a pretty conservative state, so instead of funding a government program with the money, they just give it back to their citizens as a dividend.
Welcome to Alaska. Here's $1,000.
Well, it's about time. But why?
We pay every resident $1,000 to allow the oil companies to ravage our state's natural beauty.
That makes it a pretty popular program. Or consider how Costa Rica levied a gas tax, and then used the revenue to incentivize farmers to keep forest on their property. Their economy's doing much better than before this tax, and many who were formerly farmers are now running ecotourism organizations. And in most of the US, we already have taxes on gasoline. They could be raised without changing the price at the pump very much, because so much of that price is based on changes in supply. And at the very least, we can all stand to be a little bit less afraid of taxes and a little more open to the good they can do us. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.